So hello everybody. Hopefully this will switch over to me in a moment. So hello everybody. Welcome to our discussion on graduate school in IO psychology. This is hosted by the Society for Industrial Organizational Psychology. What's basically going to be happening today is we got about an hour of content of specific questions that I'll be asking to a set of panelists who I'll introduce you to in just a moment. We'll have about an hour of that again, and then about 30 minutes of live question and answer afterward. If you do have questions, you can do so anytime through the interface that you're looking at. We won't necessarily answer them right that minute, but they will come during that question and answer period. I'll definitely make sure to swing back and answer absolutely everything that we have time to answer. So my name is Richard Landers. I'm on the faculty at Old Dominion University. I'm also a writer for the Neo Academic blog. If you have been looking for information on graduate school at IO Psychology, you might have seen it already. Now I'm going to introduce our panel, and I'm going to ask that each of them introduce themselves very briefly as well. So first, let's start with Dr. Russell Matthews at Bowling Green.
My name is Russell Matthews, and I'm an associate professor and Sandman professor of industrial organizational psychology. I've been before BG, I was at LSU, and I've been doing graduate admissions basically for 9 years, or ever since I became a faculty member. So I've reviewed a fair number of applications at this point in time.
Thank you very much. Let's second move to Dr. Kurt Kraiger at Colorado State.
Hi, I'm Richard. You sound like FM very. I'm Kurt Kraiger. I'm at Colorado State University. I've been in academics for over 30 years. I spent about 20 years at a terminal master's program at University of Colorado at Denver. Spent a couple years at a PhD and master's program at University of Tulsa, and then I've been here at Colorado State for about 11 years, and I direct the online master's program in IO psychology, and I'm also coordinator of the PhD program here. So I have a lot of perspective from different angles.
Thank you very much, Kurt. Let's next get an intro from Dr. David Caughlin, Portland State.
Hi, thank you. My name is David Caughlin. I'm a visiting faculty member in the School of Business Administration at Portland State University. I guess kind of my unique experience is that I did both a terminal master's in IO psychology in one program that was at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis, and then came to Portland State University and did a PhD in IO psychology there. So I can speak to kind of both sides of that, going to a terminal master's as well as going from a terminal master's to a PhD program. And so in my current role, I'm usually trying to convince really good business school students such as management, HR students to apply for graduate school in IO psychology.
All right, thank you very much. Our next panelist is going to be Maryana Arvan.
Hi everyone, I'm Maryana Arvan. I'm a third-year doctoral student in IO psychology at the University of South Florida, and I exclusively applied to PhD graduate programs in IO psychology, as well as a few organizational behavior programs, so I can speak to that perspective as a recent PhD student applicant.
Great, thank you very much. And our final panelist, last but certainly not least, is Michael Schulman.
So I graduated a little while ago at this point from undergraduate, and although I've been involved in IO research on a part-time basis for almost 2 years, I'm really here because I'm wrapping up what's actually round 2 of applications for me. So I can speak to that. I happen to be at the decision-making point of everything, but the most recent of all of us here.
All right, well thank you very much. So now we're going to move into our main kind of question portion. I have a variety of prepared questions that we'll be getting feedback from the panelists on. The first, which is actually directed to everyone, so I would encourage anyone to jump in on this one that would like to. Why were you first attracted to IO psychology?
Well, I can go first, and I'll try to make it really short. I was, as an undergraduate, I think probably like 75% of all doctoral students, I began psychology thinking I wanted to go into counseling. But I really, the longer I went into that, I really kind of thought whether emotionally that was something that I wanted to do. It didn't quite capture my interest, and I took a industrial psych class as a junior. Just really got excited by the content, and it really kind of resonated with me. So I wound up applying to IO psychology programs based on that one course, probably though without a full understanding of what IO was. I came much later in graduate school.
That's interesting because that's something that I've heard echoed by a number of other people that took a course, and that's where it started. And that's really where it started for me also. I took a course, I had an open slot, it sounded really interesting. It happened to come at a time that I was becoming disinterested in clinical psychology, and I'd had interest in the corporate world but didn't want to go into business. And with that course, it really all came together. I liked what I'd be studying, what I'd be doing, what my work would be accomplishing. And there were definitely other things at the time that pushed things along, but that course, Professor Schwarzmer, that was where it all started for me.
So this might be a good time for me to jump in as well, because my interest also started with an introductory course, which I actually ended up taking through the business school because I was not a psychology major as an undergraduate. I was an English major, and I had a business minor. So I took an intro to IO course in the business school. And I was just completely fascinated by the topics because for me it was just so practically relevant to a fundamental part of the human experience, right? We all work, we can all talk about it. Almost all of us can relate to each other on the fact that work is a big part of our lives. So to have a field that kind of looked at it through a scientific lens and was focused on how to make the workplace better, not just for companies, but for people, was really interesting to me. And then also from the practical side, as I kind of delved more into the field and learned a little bit more about it, I found it very appealing that the employment prospects were so good and that there were so many diverse opportunities for careers. So that's how I got interested.
And I guess I'll take it next. I came from it from a different direction. When I was applying or thinking about grad school, I have never taken an intro psych course. I've never taken an intro IO course either. And what happened was my advisor at the time said, hey, you like research? And then he's like, you can also make a very comfortable salary doing this. And that really appealed to me at that point in time. So it was my love of research, love of stats, and then my desire to have a more comfortable lifestyle and not have to deal with people's problems day in, day out as a clinical psychologist.
Yeah, it's kind of a common thread, I think, amongst folks that we all have very dramatically different kind of approaches and what brought us into IO. For me personally, I actually took a testing course as an undergrad. I thought the idea of being able to give somebody a survey, get something meaningful out of that information was just a really cool idea and something I was really personally interested in, so I started to move in that direction myself. Well, let's now move on to our next question, which we're going to get a little more structured now. So first, is IO psychology the right psychology program for me? Probably a question a number of you have asked yourselves. And I'll toss this one to Kurt. What do you think?
I think that it really depends on compared to what. So there's a fair amount of content overlap with social psychology in terms of types of problems and the interface of people and context. But I think if you like IO, you really need to be kind of very interested in the applied aspects of it, how it plays out in organizational context as opposed to just kind of understanding people. I think you heard a lot in terms of our intros about some of the differences in why you would be interested in IO in terms of counseling. And it's really kind of making kind of system level change as opposed to kind of working with individuals. One thing I didn't mention at the beginning is when I was an undergrad and I was kind of weighing where do I want to go, I was talking to a 6th or 7th year graduate student in counseling psych who was starting to do management consulting. And he said one of the differences he saw is that when you work with someone in counseling psychology for 3 or 4 years as a therapist, oftentimes they're still not in a position to be able to thank you. And he said he loves management consulting because oftentimes his clients are appreciative of understanding that difference. And then the last point is a lot of times I'll talk to students and say I really like HR, and so I think I wanted to go on into IO psychology. It's really understanding the difference between Psychology in an organizational context is doing the research that establishes best practice that's then turned over to HR, where HR then does the interviews, conducts the survey, and so forth. Really kind of understanding those differences between the delivery of services and research and design of those services, I think, is really important to understand before moving forward with graduate school.
Thank you. Well, let's now get even more specific. Let's think about the difference between PhD and master's. Now that you know you want to do IO psychology with that bit of convincing you just got, what do you think the difference is between a master's and a PhD program? What can you do with a master's versus a PhD? Russell, can you give us some light there?
So I think for students interested in going in master's versus PhD, you'll get a lot of advice from a lot of different people. And I think one of the big things to keep in mind is that there is a wide spectrum of both master's level and PhD programs, and in part that brings, for some programs, the difference is a lot smaller. So you have some masters, terminal masters, that are embedded in larger PhD IO programs. Those are going to have a different feel. For me, the difference in what you tend to see is, as Kurt was mentioning, if you're in a PhD program, you're tending to design and develop a lot of the tools and best practices, whereas master's programs tend to be more, they can be more practitioner-oriented. But you can have practitioner-oriented PhD programs, and you can have very research-oriented master's programs. And part of it is just trying to decide, 2-year degree, get out, potentially get a job, or 2-year degree to prepare yourself to get into a PhD program. That's another very common path. And then PhD programs, same sort of thing. You can plan to go academic and become a researcher, or you can plan to become a consultant, internally or externally. So I think trying to define the differences is kind of difficult to some degree. One of the differences that I see, though, is that in a PhD program, you tend to go to your PhD program and know that you're going to move somewhere else. Where you get your master's degree, you tend to stay where you get your master's degree, just because of the networks that have to be developed and the nature of employment after the fact. I think Kurt probably has some additional information to add to that.
Yeah, so a couple of comments. One is I want to echo what Russell said about the variety of master's programs. So you might be applying to a master's program because you want to get your PhD, but maybe your grades aren't good enough, or you don't have enough research experience. If that's the case, you really want to be looking at doctoral programs that have research active faculty who give you a thesis option, who give you the options to do research beyond your thesis, because you're really going to need to do that to get into a doctoral program. Not all master's programs do that, so you need to be really careful about choice. If your goal is to go to graduate school for 2 years, get your master's degree in practice, IO psychology is probably one of the best, if not the best, area of psychology where you can work and do good work with a master's degree. I think there are 3 differences between the work that you do with a master's and the work that you do with a PhD. I'm talking about just in an applied context, not being in the university setting. One is that PhD salaries are larger. So to go back to Russell's comment about a comfortable salary, your salary becomes more comfortable usually, not always, but usually with a PhD. And along with that, you have a kind of a larger, more autonomy, larger span of control. So you may be doing some project management or leadership roles in addition to the IO work. Fundamentally, the biggest difference I see between master's level practitioners and PhDs is that usually when you come out with a master's degree and you get a good job, you can do exactly the type of stuff that you've learned about in school, and students love that. You tend to be really slotted in terms of what you do. So you're the survey guy, or you're doing test development and validation, you're doing job analyses, and that's pretty much all you do for the first year or so. Whereas with a PhD, you might be doing some survey work, some test development, some leadership development, much broader array of tasks. So usually what I recommend graduates of our master's programs is they really think about a career arc where they're changing jobs maybe 3 or 4 times in 5 or 6 years, and moving from being the survey person to the test development person to the job analysis person to really get the same portfolio of experiences that they would immediately out of the gate as a PhD.
Great. Could you, Kurt, also give some feedback on the advantages and disadvantages of online master's programs specifically?
Sure. So, and so just like you see an array of options with face-to-face on-campus courses, you're starting to see there's now about 10 online master's courses, and there's going to be a lot of differences in the emphasis and quality of those as well. And so again, my advice is be really, to think about what your career goals are, and how that one, whatever the online program you're applying to, matches those career goals. I'm, like you, Richard, I think I'm a proponent of online education, and I think you can get a really high quality education in an online context, the same as a face-to-face. I'm going to focus my answer here on kind of the differences on the employment side, and I actually published a paper 3 or 4 years ago where we surveyed employers, IO psychologists who work for consulting firms, and we gave them scenarios where the applicant came out of a PhD versus a master's program, came out of an online versus face-to-face, and we asked them, would you hire this person, would you interview them, how much would you pay them? And there's clearly a big difference, and it's not surprising. Most IO psychologists who work in consulting agencies, at least in our study, would rather hire the PhD than the master's, would rather hire the person from the face-to-face versus the online. So I think it's, and again, I direct an online program, so I'm sensitive to that. So I think it's really incumbent on you to, as Russell said, make sure that you network while you're in school, join local organizations, try to find an internship, and really try to pick up as much experience as you can, because I think there's, at least for the next 5-10 years, there's going to be a bias against someone with an online degree. But if you can say, these are the projects I've worked on, these are the skills that I have, you can start to overcome some of those.
Yeah, the real problem with online education to me is not necessarily the online itself, but that's just that it's so easy to have a very bad online program. So when you find the good ones, and I think Colorado State is a great example of this, then those are the ones that you want to seek if you want that kind of experience. So let's turn to next question here. Why choose a master's program? And I'm gonna send that to David.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think this kind of ties into why how I got into IO psychology to begin with, which is I did not have a course in IO psychology while I was at Indiana University. I think it just fell during 4 years where that wasn't offered. And so I wasn't sure exactly what it was, and I was working full-time after undergraduate in a clinical neuroscience lab, and one of the postdocs there was talking to me about career prospects and so forth, and she suggested IO psychology and said that it was both good job outlook and could be a little bit more lucrative as well. And so that was really attractive to me, particularly the part about the good job outlook. And so I wasn't sure at that point, since I'd never had a class. I bought a textbook on IO psychology. I wasn't 100% sure I wanted to commit to a 4 or 5, 6 year PhD program. So I decided to do a 2-year terminal master's program, which was actually an outstanding experience. I really, even though I went on to get a PhD later, I really appreciated that experience. The program that I went to had a lot of both research and practice. They had a thesis, which was nice, which really set the stage for going on to a PhD program. So that was my major decision-making point, was, do I really want to commit to something for 5 years if I don't really know what it is? And after about 6 months in the program, I realized what it was, and at that point, I started prepping for going to apply to PhD programs.
Great. Well, Maryana, let's get the flip side. Why choose a PhD program?
So that's a good question. I chose a PhD program primarily for one reason, which is that I had always been pretty sure I wanted to pursue an academic career. I liked the flexibility that the PhD offered, which is that you could do either the applied side or the academic side. But if you want to pursue an academic career, really you need a PhD if you want to be a full-time faculty member. There are some teaching opportunities for masters, but they typically are part-time positions. So because I knew I was erring towards the academic side, I wanted to do a PhD program.
Great, thank you. So, PhD versus master's is actually the most popular part of the blog I run. We have something like 500 or 600 questions now, comments on that post with people trying to navigate these waters. So it is a big question. It's a really hard one, but one definitely worth thinking about. Let's get in.
Richard, can I add one thing to that? So one thing to think about is if you believe your ultimate goal is a PhD, so you've thought through it, you've gotten good advice, you think, and you have the grades and so forth to do that, oftentimes I'll hear someone say, well, I think what I want to do is go somewhere and get my master's degree, then take some time off, and then think about what I want to do, then apply to a PhD program. And you may have good personal reasons to want to do that, but generally I caution against that for a couple of reasons. One is graduate school at both the master's and the PhD level is tough, and once you get into it, you might as well finish. But secondly, when I look at, I think a lot of people on admissions committees look at someone coming out of a doctoral program, and I'm sorry, coming out of a master's program, one of the questions that comes to mind is, well, why are they in a master's program now? So if, for example, we were looking at David, he might have said, 2 or 3 years ago, I didn't really know what I wanted to do, so I wanted to get some focus, and now I know, and this is exactly what I want to do. He's able to answer that question, and I would feel comfortable with it. But you need to understand that people are going to be asking this, well, why did you lack confidence? Did you lack research? Did you have bad undergraduate grades? And it's going to be up to you to kind of anticipate what those questions are and say something in your application materials to address those. So sometimes, particularly if you have the test scores, the research experience, it's better just to take the, as you just heard 2 good examples, this is really what I want to do. It's better, I think, just to take the plunge and apply directly to the PhD program.
Great, thanks so much. Well, let's turn a little bit now to how we actually learn about the programs we might want to attend. It's a really huge question. You want a master's or a PhD, and you say, well, how? I mean, there's so many places. How do I figure out that question? So, Michael, can you give us a little information about how you can find out about programs, maybe about how you did? Oh.
Sorry, yeah, I got that.
Yeah.
So the first place is really just a master list of programs. I know for clinical psychology, there's a book of it. For IO, I found the SIOP website to be the best first stop, and there's just a great, exhaustive, I believe, list of different programs there. The biggest sources of info, and consequently the hardest to wade through, are going to be the websites of the various schools, and that's probably where you're going to spend the most time. If you have any connections in IO, it could be good to reach out to those people, particularly when you're trying to determine reputation of various programs. It is a lot of info. I found it useful to use a spreadsheet, actually a color-coded spreadsheet, to keep everything organized. But it's a big process. If anybody else has another source of info that I totally missed, kick in on that. But this is the way I went through it.
Yeah, I actually remember when I applied to graduate school, folks that were in my cohort on some of our visitation weekends, we started to share our spreadsheets that we had created, massive amounts of information. So I think being super organized and really figuring out exactly what you know is really great advice. So when we look at this information, though, what do you think is what you should be looking for? Like, what specific pieces of information are really the most important? Maybe Russell, you can start us off.
For me, I think what I always encourage students is information that's going to help you figure out fit. I think as I mentioned earlier, there's lots of different types of programs out there, and you need to figure out where you're going to fit most effectively if you're applied oriented. And this advice I think is true for master's or PhD. Trying to get pieces of information that help you determine, okay, is this a research oriented program? Oftentimes the websites, most programs now all have websites, some are better than others, but trying to figure out, for example, how many of the faculty there do you think you could work with? And the advice I always say is, what you think you want to do when you start your first day of grad school, that's probably not what you're going to be studying come 3 years later. So find that one faculty member who you think you might work with, but have a couple backups that might also fit. And again, that's master's or PhD, because these are people you're going to be working with for 4 or 5, 2, 5 years. And then other pieces of information, just trying to figure out what life is like as a student there. So those are just some of the... Fit is this big category, and for different people, fit is going to mean something different. One of the weird things that I always recommend is, if you have a significant other, trying to figure out, will they fit where you might be moving to. On the admissions committee, I see that all the time. Well, I would have gone there, but my spouse, there's no way they could get a job. Well, there might be information that you can get from faculty or from current students who can help you figure that out, more so than just poking around online every once in a while.
Thank you. Kurt, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, the one thing I would add is, when I talk to prospective students, I try to talk about fit, I try to talk about culture, but I really encourage them to reach out to both current students and alumni of the program. This is both master's or PhD. I feel like part of my job is to recruit good students, and if I like them, so I'm in my recruiting mode. And it's such an important decision that you're going to be spending 2 to 5 years of your life working with faculty and students, that I wouldn't trust a single source of information. So if you're talking with faculty at different schools, I would ask for the names of students that you could talk to and get their perspective. I could tell you this is a terrific place to be and we're all happy here, but you need to hear that from some of the students and past students as well. But before you can really trust that information.
Yeah, that's the #1 piece of advice that I give out all the time. People ask me specifically, what do you think about this program? I said, I can't make that judgment. Contact a student there, talk to the people in that program, and ask them. Great. Michael, do you have any thoughts about this?
Not that much. The contacting people is an interesting thing, not only about the program, but sometimes about the professor that you would be looking at working with. That ended up being a big source of information. Also, this may hold true more for PhD versus master's or vice versa, but sometimes you get a sense of what the goal of the program is, what they want, what kind of students they're looking to put out. Like, I was looking at organizational behavior for a while, and I saw that they're very clearly focused on putting out academics, and I wanted something that would be more flexible over there, so that wouldn't work. That blends of research, applied, evenly split, how that fits with your career goals is going to be a big deal.
Great. So we've been talking a little bit about reaching out to individual faculty. I wonder if we can dig a little more into that. Kurt, what do you think the etiquette is around actually reaching out to people ahead of time?
Right. So this is my personal opinion. There has to be a book or a website somewhere that tells undergraduates sometime in the fall before you apply, send your resume or CV to all of the faculty members at a program and tell them that you love their research and you'd love to work there. Is there any questions that you could answer? And because I get like 25 or 30 of those every fall, they always begin, I know you're too busy to read this email, or I know you're really busy right now, but I wanted to reach out. And to be honest, my first reaction is, yeah, I'm a little bit too busy, that my focus tends to be on my current students, not prospective students. I don't mean that to sound harsh, but it is the case. That's where my focus is. So yeah, I don't think that it hurts you to reach out and send personalized emails to individual faculty, but I'm really questioning kind of the value of it. I think in 30-some years of doing this, I've had maybe 3-4 students who have emailed me, sent me personal emails, I'd like your work, I'd like to work with you. that I wound up accepting, or we wound up accepting into the program. So I think you're better off investing that time in thinking about how that program fits what your research interests are, what you can contribute to the program, and focusing on the application as opposed to reaching out to individual faculty. And just to be clear, this is all kind of pre-application. If you've been accepted, I think the more dialogue you have with the faculty, the better, because they want to get to know you, you want to get to know them, and this is a really important decision for you.
So I heard a bit of a laugh, I think, from Russell. Do you agree with this?
Yeah, so that's been my experiences, and just the number of students who contact me who never end up applying, and maybe that's a good thing, I don't know, they at least self-selected out, and that's part of the process, but it doesn't help as much as I think a lot of people think it does. Oh, I'll get my foot in the door. I will say that reaching out is not necessarily a bad thing if there are specific questions that are being asked. My biggest frustration, I think it's probably similar to Kurt, is when they ask me questions that are easily identifiable on our website or SIOP website. So they ask, are you admitting students? Well, on our website it clearly states if a faculty member is admitting students or not. So asking that question is your first question. Now if it's a specific question about a project, are you still working in this line of research and that's something I'm interested in doing, I feel like that's a different conversation. Like Kurt though, I think we faculty talk all the time, and we find out that Joe Schmo emailed all 7 of us with the exact same email saying we'd love to work with you. That actually reflects more poorly than not reaching out at all. The caveat that I'll throw out that goes back to one of the questions we just were discussing is reaching out to current students, and I think that actually is more helpful. Reaching out with, again, specific questions, not a laundry list of 15 questions that would take 5 or 6 emails to respond to, but 3 or 4 targeted questions to current students just to kind of get a feel for the program. I think that's helpful in terms of weeding things out. But we faculty keep in mind that there's 130, 140 applicants every year to every program almost. That's a lot of people to try and keep in contact with, and we're not going to remember necessarily that this person emailed us when we're looking at applications.
Mm-hmm. You know, one of the things that happens when people email me is I immediately think, is this person emailing me because someone told them to? And it's usually really obvious when a person says, oh, hi, how are you? Are you accepting students? I am interested in your lab. That is such a generic email that does not really do much for you. So, so really think carefully about that issue. So let's move a little bit more specific into actually applying to these programs. Once you've figured out which ones you like, where are you going to actually apply? What does that involve? What are the pieces? So David, can you tell us a little bit about when to apply and what the pieces of an application are?
Absolutely. So I went through this process a couple times, and generally you're going to be applying in the fall of the year before you'd like to be admitted. So if you would like to, let's say, fall of 2018, you would apply in fall of 2017. And that said, some of the due dates will be due, usually master's due dates are going to be due January, February, sometimes even March. I've noticed Canadian programs tend to be due in March as opposed to programs in the States, so that's something to consider as well. But the planning process needs to start, I'd say, at least a year in advance, if not several years in advance, because one of the main requirements, at least for a PhD program, and not always the case for a master's program, is prior research experience. And so that's something you definitely want to get a head start in. I always think that it's good for people to have at least a year experience doing that to make sure it's what they really want, because that can be a good fit for them. And then also to give yourself time to take the GRE. There's both the subject test, which is psychology specific, which some programs require, as well as the more general test. The subject test is very specific to psychology, doesn't have a lot of content related to IO psychology, but it has a lot of kind of classical psych content. And my recommendation is if you take that as soon as you're done with your bachelor's degree, when you finish all your psych coursework, so that stuff is fresh in your mind, because it'll ask a lot about famous psychologists over history and things like that that are pretty quick to be forgotten. Another thing is giving yourself time to kind of cultivate relationships with faculty members in terms of usually most programs, master's or PhD, will require 3 letters of recommendation. So it's important to make sure that you have at least one or two of those letters be pretty strong or quite strong, and then the third one maybe not quite as strong, but at least have three people that can speak to your classroom performance, your research performance, or maybe even your applied performance depending on the program. Make sure you have a good GPA, especially in the last couple of years, and your major specific GPA, make sure that's quite good. And personal statements are a really key component too. And that is something that I think is really important to spend some time thinking about how this is going to reflect on you, and not being afraid to kind of talk yourself up. I was very uncomfortable with that process, but I had to kind of have it reviewed by a few people who said, no, that you need to say more good things about yourself and not kind of tone down any accomplishments. So I think that's where outside feedback can be really, really instrumental. And then kind of there's a couple pieces that might be wild cards depending upon whether or not the program will require them, and that's a CV or a resume. Sometimes I remember those being required, and a writing sample, whether that's like a senior honors thesis or some term paper you've written. And a final bit that is important to consider is having access to transcripts of any institution that you attended. And sometimes it's cheaper to buy those signed and sealed before you actually graduate from the institution. Sometimes they put a surcharge on that after you're an alumni of the institution. So if you know you're going to apply, maybe look into that. Maybe it's even free at your university. So that's something to consider as well. And I think those are the main things I can think of.
Great. Well, so it sounds an awful lot like the timeline for prepping is pretty long. Maryana, can you tell us a little bit about what you might do to prepare for applying, like a year or two in advance before you start to submit your materials?
Yes, absolutely. So David touched on this a little bit, but I would say a couple of years out, you need to really be focused on two things: getting research experience and also building relationships with the faculty members who ideally will write you a letter of recommendation to grad school. And in an ideal world, those 2 points will be related to each other. So hopefully you will have the opportunity to work for faculty in a research assistantship capacity, and they'll ultimately be able to speak to your performance in that way. Perhaps you'll even be able to take a class with them. But those are really the two biggest things. And one thing that I kind of wanted to mention is that obviously there aren't that many IO programs around the country. A lot of the students watching this probably may not have an IO program at their school. And in that case, I would say any experience in psychology is going to be a benefit. Perhaps you can even do a senior honors thesis where you can make something more relevant to IO, like apply a social psychology concept or a clinical psychology concept and try to meld it somehow with IO psychology. And another thing too is oftentimes when you email faculty, you guys are very busy, and if a student wants to inquire about a position open in the lab to be an RA, sometimes faculty don't have any openings. But if there are graduate students there, I would definitely suggest reaching out to them, because that can be a good gateway to sort of start an introduction with the faculty member ultimately, and also get that experience that you can talk about in your personal statement. Oops. Sorry, you're on mute.
Oh, thank you. I'm going to very briefly go sideways from our panel discussion right now and say that we're having a little bit of technical difficulty with the Q&A function, so if you do have questions, please leave them in the comment section instead, and then we'll get to them there. Let's continue on our discussion about applying. So we've gone with what we do kind of long term. What about really short term? Michael, can you tell us a little bit about what you should do in those like final 6 months before you actually submit?
Sure. Well, the final 6 months are really the process of putting together all the pieces of the application, and David touched on a lot of this, because there are parts of this that you may want to start with pretty early, and there are parts that about 6 months is the right time frame. Think about who you want as recommenders, who can write you a strong recommendation letter. You want to request those letters early and open the applications early, because you don't want them to have the pressure of submitting. The personal statement is a very important part of your application. So the earlier you start brainstorming and thinking about your story, the more you may have to write, and the better you may be able to tell that. And you also may want to start reading the professor's research, at least those you're really interested in at a very early point, and reaching out to professors or not, depending. My yardstick was how genuinely can I do that. And then the last thing is going to be selecting the schools that you're going to apply to and narrowing that down.
Oh, great. So all of this discussion about things to prepare super long term probably has a few folks worried. I commonly at ODU we have students who are talking about, oh, I'm a first or second semester senior. I need to get to grad school. How do I do it? What is my last minute hope? What can I do to get into grad school? So, Russell, can you tell us, if you are a senior and you want to apply, what do you do? What do you need to worry about?
For me, one of the things that I'd like to stress here, again, where I'm at in the programs, we tend to look, we're looking for research active students with a lot of research experience. So, but I think one of the things that's missing here is that we're in an applied field, so students who have a lot of work experience, not being afraid to play that up, especially if they're coming to IO late. I tend to actually look for students who have some sort of work experience, because I like to know that they have a way to apply. And so in your personal statement, if you're just now coming into the dark side of IO psychology, yay, dark side, trying to figure out ways that you can start applying IO concepts to things that you've done in the work environment. So if you're interested in counterproductive work behaviors, identifying a supervisor who may have done some of those counterproductive behaviors, and starting to, you may not have the research experience, but you can start to articulate in your personal statement, like someone mentioned, that you have an interest in these sorts of things. I also know that in master's programs, they tend to look at those sorts of things as well as, do you have work experience? Can you apply some of the things that you've learned while out in the quote-unquote real world and come in and apply it in the education standpoint? There's lots of students, as I think Ariana mentioned, Maryana, where there are no IO programs, there's no IO faculty. You can be creative, and I think that's one of the strengths of IO psychology, is just being creative and creating links and you creating those links and saying, here's a connection, here's a connection. That speaks well for a lot of students in their applications.
So I have 3 suggestions. One echoes a few things you've already heard, and that's the importance of the personal statement. And I emphasize that because as a senior, you can't do much about your grades. You could be involved in research, but as you heard, you should have been doing that for a while. But the personal statement is one thing that you still have a lot of control over. I still see, for both the master's program and PhD programs, I'll see in a personal statement, I like to help people, I like business, I like to help people in business. And when you hear that, that sounds like, I call that academic maturity. The person who says that, I don't feel like they know what they're getting themselves into in graduate school. But if they say things like, I'm really interested in personnel selection and helping organizations identify ways of identifying characteristics of good applicants for different types of work environments, whether that matches my research interests or not, it shows that they have a really good understanding of what IO psychology is, and they're much more ready for school. So really thinking about what you want to say, how it reflects on your understanding of what you're going to do professionally, how the school helps you get there. Recognizing those things could change, but you still want to be able to articulate a vision. So the personal statement is one. Second is, a lot of times, and you may be in this boat, you didn't score as well as you would like to on the GRE, and you thought you should have scored higher. So if you may say, well, I'm just going to explain that in one of my personal statements and say, I don't take tests well, I wasn't, something else happened. The problem that we have on our end is that we have your information, but we also have maybe 20 or 30 people who has the same GPA as you, same research experience, but does test well. So the specific recommendation I have is that could be the case, that something happened on that particular GRE, and see if you can have one of your letter writers address that instead of you. So you don't sound apologetic, you don't sound like you're making excuses, but if you had someone who said, this person writes extremely well in my class, I'm not sure why their GRE verbal was as low as it was, but in my opinion it's not as reflective of their potential as their grade point average, that's much more helpful to you than you saying those things. And third, we haven't talked about how many schools you apply to, but my recommendation is apply to as many schools as you can afford to, and that's both financially and in terms of time, and try to stratify those schools. So as you heard from Michael, there's a lot of great information on what are the norms for average GREs and GPAs, what are schools looking for, and of all the schools you can apply to, try to find about a 20%, 25% that would be stretch schools for you. They look like they're looking at a caliber of students slightly above you, but if you could get in there, great. Try to identify, and this holds, by the way, at the PhD or master's level, there's maybe a quarter of the schools that you should be able to get into. You're well above the norms for what they admit. And then in the middle are a bunch of schools that you should be competitive for. It doesn't hurt to have 3 or 4 schools that you could say no to. Thank you, I'm glad you admitted me, but I've made a choice to go somewhere else that actually feels really good. But if you only apply to a narrow range of schools, you may not get in. So again, the advice is to try to apply to as many schools in a range of schools at both the PhD and master's level.
Yeah, the idea of investment in your future, I think, is an important one that you really highlight there. When people say, oh, I don't know if I want to spend the extra $60 to apply to one more school, that is just about the cheapest investment in your career you will ever make. So really, really worth it to apply quite broadly. Say, Kurt, can you continue and maybe talk a little bit about kind of the opposite side, like the perfect, ideal applicant? What does that person look like? What have they done?
Yeah, so I think it's just a summary of a lot of things we talked about, and I'm going to I'll try to be brief, but at the PhD level, they have really solid, not necessarily a 4.0, but a really solid GPA. They have a couple years of research experience, not necessarily in IO, but they understand research. They've been responsible for their own research. They've maybe done a thesis, or they've taken a lead on the project. They can articulate what IO is, and how, what their career goals are, and how this program is reflective of that. And really at the master's level, we haven't talked as much about the master's level, but I think the same thing applies. For example, at Colorado State, our cutoff scores for GREs and GPA are lower for the master's program than they are for the PhD program, but they're still pretty competitive. We're less interested in research, research experience, but we may be interested in work experience. We have someone, they might be a little bit older, they've worked in business for a couple of years, they understand that side of it. But again, the really key thing is if they're able to articulate in their personal statement, I know exactly what someone with a master's level degree does, that's the type of work that I want to do, and I believe your program is a path for me to get the skills that I need to move into that career path. Again, I can't emphasize enough the value of a really targeted personal statement that's so targeted towards the program you're applying to, but also on target in terms of what that program has to offer.
Well, great. Russell, what do you think?
I'm going to echo something that Kurt said earlier about academic maturity. Somebody who they've done their due diligence and genuinely understand maybe not the nitty-gritty details about the program that they're applying to, but the big picture, what does this program specialize in? Different programs have different niches. Some programs are very broad-based, some are very focused on how they train their students. I think I can tell you what the ideal student isn't oftentimes. It's they have this one sentence, and this is why your program is a good fit for me, and that's like the only statement they say. The students who tend to do better articulate, okay, this faculty member, these are some of the interests I'm interested in. This faculty member, I'm also interested in this. And again, on the flip side, it's when a student says, this is exactly what I'm going to study for the next 5-6 years, that shows me that they're not academically mature yet. Again, it goes back to that. You may have been introduced to one Intro to IO Psych course where you had a chapter on one topic. There are hundreds of other topics that you might get introduced to in grad school, and realizing and being flexible with that and having some general interests, I think that's important, but demonstrating that you're adaptable and interested in learning more is really, really important to me personally. And again, just because of the students we try to admit here, a strong research portfolio. I think Kurt mentioned it, not necessarily in IO. Some of my favorite students, and I say this term jokingly, rat runners, like their training was in neuroscience, and they realized, you know what, I can't get a job in neuroscience maybe. So I like IO, and here's why, and let me articulate why. But what I learned while running rats was X, Y, and Z, and articulating that and translating it into the IO field is a very important skill to have.
Great. So for our last 10 minutes, let's talk about what happens next. So say you have applied to a program, and you've reached that first hurdle. They've invited you for an interview. It's a very stressful time for a lot of students. David, can you tell us a little bit about what that process is like?
So assuming David, yeah, I can tell you a little bit about it. And so usually there's some kind of phone interview that happens beforehand, and then whether or not you do well in that, you might get asked to come to actually visit the program. And so upon visiting, it can look very different depending upon what program you're applying to, whether it's a master's or PhD. Having done a number of the site visits when I was applying to both types of programs, some would be incredibly structured, where I would meet with certain faculty members. It seemed like they had structured interview questions that they asked consistently of all the candidates. And then others were very, very unstructured, very informal, more conversational. It seemed like they were really just trying to focus in on and understand whether or not you would be a good fit in the program in terms of personality and interests and things like that. So it's the whole spectrum. So I think I would suggest preparing as though you're going to have an extremely structured type of interview process. And that way, if it ends up being more casual or informal, you'll be able to relax a little bit more.
Interesting. Maryana, is that the same advice you give, or what do you have to add?
That is very good advice, because I was going to say something similar, which is that there's a lot of variance in how schools will conduct an interview weekend. One thing that I find is increasingly common is to have multiple students visit at the same time, a sort of recruitment weekend, so to speak. And those tend to be more structured. So there's usually time where you meet with faculty, particularly ones that you may potentially be interested in working with. You meet with graduate students. Those are typically 1.5 to 2 days long. And what David said, I also want to echo, which is that a lot of times it can be to assess sort of fit. So do you fit with the faculty member that you might potentially work with? Do you fit with multiple faculty members? Are you sort of a collegial professional individual who'd be a good addition to the department? And they can be stressful, but you power through them, and at the end of the day, it usually ends up working out where you feel really good about your visit with, some more than others, and it ends up being a good outcome.
Yeah, it's certainly very stressful kind of thing. One of the big issues for me personally when I did this was a particular question that happens, which is, do you have any questions? That's something that people ask constantly in these situations. Like, do you have any questions I can answer? And you feel like there's a right answer to that question. Russell, do you have any advice about good questions to ask during that interview process?
I think any question that helps you figure out if this is where you want to spend the next 2 to 5 years of your life is a good question. Oftentimes, in admissions, for most of the programs I'm aware of, there are a few where there are interview weekends and they make decisions after that. But most programs, you're admitted and then brought out for a recruitment weekend, and you have an offer or you're on the wait list, which means usually that they're wanting to admit you. They just don't have enough offers. But having those questions that help you figure out, is this a place you want to go? I think one of the things that I always kind of find a little entertaining is that recruitment weekend, that's the two-way street where you're getting, as an applicant, getting information about the program. The program has already decided that they like you. And so going in a little bit more relaxed and getting the information you need to make an informed decision is important. Specific questions that can be asked, current research, where they might fit, is there a particular project that they might get involved in? I think trying to ask questions about how they mentor, like what is your mentoring style, making sure that mentoring style fits with you. But I think one of the issues is having questions for the grad students as well. It was brought up earlier that they're the ones who are going to be able to tell you most about what the program's really like. We faculty are in recruitment mode, and our job is to sell the program. The students can give you a much better, broader feel of what life might be like at that program for that given period of time.
So you just used a word, mentorship. I'm wondering, Kurt, can you tell us more about what a mentorship model is and how that varies across schools?
Sure. So, yeah, so as an applicant, and we're primarily talking about a PhD model now, this would be something that there is a lot of variety across schools, and it would be something that's worthwhile knowing. Although, having said that, I think issues of fit and the program function, what do they tend to train science practitioners, more academics? I think some of those are maybe the more important questions. But in a mentorship model, the notion is that as an applicant, you're likely to be admitted to work with a particular faculty member. So I do training research. If CSU had a mentorship model, which it doesn't, I would select one candidate out of the pool who's interested in doing training research, and that person would likely work with me through the PhD. For programs that don't have a mentorship model, they're much more likely to try to build in some diversity in terms of interest and background among the class. The expectation might be that you do your master's program, your master's degree rather, with one faculty member, perhaps a PhD with a second, and then be working with several other faculty members. So there are differences. I think to the extent that you can kind of ascertain that from the website or from talking to students, probably if it's a mentorship program and you're an applicant, you really want to kind of gear your personal statement more towards, the thing I really want to do is training research or whatever that particular is. Now, you don't want to lie, because if you are really interested in doing organizational justice and you said you wanted to do training research and you come to Colorado State, and we're not a good fit because our research interests are different, that's not going to work out for you either. But in general, the more tailored, the more the mentorship model is followed by the program, the more probably specific you'd like to be in your research statement.
Well, great. So this process is a pretty long one, as I hope you folks have recognized here. I'm wondering, from Michael, who has probably most recently been through it, what was the most surprising part of this whole process?
So some of this Maryana touched on, and some of the others. First of all, the variation, how the process can be so different for different schools. Some have phone interviews, some have in-person interviews, some just don't believe interviews are valid sources of info at all. A big visitation, individual visitation, not knowing what to expect. I guess this wasn't addressed in the last webinar. That really took me by surprise. And also the unpredictability of some of it. Like, you don't know what is going to stick. There are many stories of people that didn't get into the schools they considered safety schools, and they got into their dream schools. How that can be just unpredictable really took me by surprise. And like reaching out to professors fits into that a little bit as well. It may be a big deal because that may be the piece that sticks, and it may do nothing. Those two things I think were what really took me aback.
Wow. Well, let me ask the same question from a slightly different perspective. If you went through this whole process again, what might you do differently this time? And let me start by asking that to Maryana.
Sure. So this one is actually easy. There are blogs out there where you can submit decisions made by different schools that you've received. So waitlisted, received an interview, received a phone call, received an invitation to visitation weekend. I was very addicted to those blogs when I applied, and what I found was that it was actually pretty toxic, so it really stressed me out. I jumped to conclusions before I should. I remember there was one day where someone posted from one of the schools that I had applied to that they had received an acceptance, and I immediately assumed that I didn't get in, and I felt devastated for the next 2 days, and then I got a call, and I also got in. So I would recommend staying away from anything like that, any job or admission wikis. it really is not a race, and you need to just focus on the information you have through official channels. Try to just focus on what's best for you rather than looking at these websites and panicking kind of about what other people are doing. So if I could do it all again, I would stay away from those websites.
What about you, David? Anything you would change?
Yeah, I think this kind of goes back to the fact that I didn't personally have a class in IO psychology offered during undergraduate. And I wish I had known that often the business schools, and Mariana's kind of touched on this, they'll often have faculty members in the management or organizational behavior, HR areas that are IO psychologists by training. And perhaps you could take a class over there, it sounds like she did, that would be in organizational behavior, HR, and sometimes those, if taught by an IO psychologist, are very much equivalent to taking an industrial and organizational psychology in a psych department. So if that's your option, I'd recommend seeing if you can take a course in that. One, to gain more direct experience, as well as to show programs that you actually know what this is and you've taken some coursework in it. And also just to draw on faculty members. If you don't have any IO psychologists in the psychology department, check other departments, not just in the business schools, but there could be other departments where you have people in public health that maybe have IO psychology degrees, or something very related that could give you some advice as well.
All right. Well, thank you to our panelists. This actually concludes the structured portion. Now we're going to turn to questions. Again, if you have any questions, please shoot them into that comment section if you haven't already. I will ask our first one, and this will be a little open to whoever wants to respond, and if no one jumps in fast enough, I probably will. But our first question is, how do we as prospective students find out about the types of research being conducted at a specific school to determine fit with our own research interests?
Well, I'll jump in first. A lot of that information is often posted on the faculty webpage. So most programs will have a program website, and then the faculty will have individual pages where they'll list out their current research interests. I would take all of that with a grain of salt. Some faculty are better or have more opportunity to update that information. So, for example, I have to go through a lengthy process to get anything I want updated on our web page. Other programs, the faculty have direct control over that, so they can update a lot faster. I personally like it when students reach out and ask, okay, I've noticed that you published on this recently, so going into PsycInfo, and you can type in the program that you're interested in as a search characteristic, and it will pull up research articles that have been published recently. Keep in mind that those articles are probably 2 years old from when the data was collected, so faculty may have moved on in their research interests. And that gives you a good opportunity to reach out and say, I noticed that in 2015 you published on this, or do you have any ongoing projects? So I personally think reaching out to the faculty, again, not just with blanket, okay, or what are you studying these days, but with specific questions is going to, again, it's that academic maturity of you've done due diligence and you've educated yourself, and then you can go and ask faculty specifically beyond just the website. I'm sure there's other ways that other folks might recommend, though.
Yeah, if you have the means, and this is a big means, then the very, very best way to get exposed to the absolute cutting-edge current work that everybody's working on is to attend the SIOP conference and see what people are presenting. That may be far away. We had it in like Hawaii a few years ago, but sometimes it's pretty close. We've done Orlando. It's been in Atlanta, Washington D.C. It just depends where it happens to be. So if you have that opportunity, it's a really great way not only to see what research people are currently doing, but also just go say, hey, hi, I'm thinking about applying to your program. Here's why I've attended your session, and just to initiate a little bit of conversation. Not everybody can do that, but if you can, it's a really great opportunity. Any other responses to this first question?
I might add to that, Richard, that even if you can't make the SIOP conference, the program is often available in PDF form online, so you could skim through that and maybe at least get an abstract of what someone is currently working on or what they just presented at SIOP.
Really great idea. That's a great idea. All right.
And sorry, I'll also chime in here. Don't forget about the graduate students. We're great resources. I've had many students email me, hey, I'm interested in Paul Spector's lab. That's my advisor. Can you tell me a little bit about the type of research that's going on in that lab? And I'm more than happy to respond, and I'll tell them about a few of the projects, usually one with each student I'll talk about. So that's another resource. If you aren't comfortable reaching out directly to faculty, then look up their graduate students.
Well, great. So let's move to question 2. What is the difference between applied and academic IO psychology? That is a huge question. If I want to go applied, what should I look for in a program? Who wants to tackle this one?
So I'll take a first crack at it. So yeah, so if an academic career would be working at a university. So you're usually you might be teaching in a PhD or a master's program, but you teach and you do research and you do service. And to get a good academic job, particularly in a PhD program, you're going to want to come out of school with 3, 4, 5 publications. You really need to be research active. So if that's the career goal that you have, the best way to do that is to get into a PhD program with a lot of research active faculty. So you talked about how you can find out what research faculty are doing. You really want to go to a program that has 3, 4, 5 faculty who seem to be pretty active and regularly publishing, because that's probably going to make it the easiest for you to do the research that you need to do to get a good academic position. Applied positions tend to be twofold. One is you could go work for a company, typically a larger company. I think Google has about 30 IO psychologists working for them. Or you may be working for the federal government, or you may be working for Frito-Lay, but you're doing things like developing leadership development programs, maybe doing organizational survey and engagement work. You may be developing an employee selection program. Incidentally, these are all, again, things that you could also do with a master's degree, but your scope is going to be a little bit narrower. So one career path is working for a single organization, doing those types of things. The other career path is working for a consulting business. So you do pretty much the same activities, but those activities are then outsourced by the company to consulting firms to come in and do the same thing. If that's your goal, different programs tend to emphasize, I would say probably put a higher priority on training people for that type of career. So I would try to get a sense of, where do graduates come out of the program and work. Oftentimes geographical location is a big driver. At Colorado State, we're in Fort Collins. While we're close to Denver, Denver isn't a industrial hub. If you were in Washington, D.C. or New York or Philadelphia or Houston, Texas, you're going to be closer to larger businesses that may be hiring IO psychologists. So location might be a factor, but really trying to get a sense of what percentage of the students come out, what types of positions do they have, and are they positions that you would consider attractive given what your career goals are.
I think I'll add something. One of the things that it's kind of my soapbox issue, is separating this notion that you have academics and then you have applied people. And it's usually a lot more integrated than gets recognized. So for example, I'm an academic, but I do a good amount of consulting on the side because it's fun and different and gives me better stories to educate my students with. And you'll see the same sort of thing. I know a large spectrum of quote-unquote applied folks who teach additionally. So they're adjunct professors at a local university and they teach a course. So there's a lot of integration. If going applied is your goal, like, believe it or not, my goal was to go applied when I first started grad school, and that's what I was going to do, and realized I don't like corporate America that much, so I went into academia. So realizing that there's a lot of variability and that can change as you're going through your graduate career, but looking at programs that have either formal or informal applied experiences. So there's a number of programs, PhD programs specifically, and even master's programs that have on-campus consulting groups where they provide consulting services. The projects are staffed by students and led by faculty. There are a fair number of programs that have those formal programs, but there's also a lot of programs where the faculty are also, again, doing individual consulting where students can get an opportunity to get involved in those sorts of things. So that can be one of your questions when you're applying to grad school, when you're talking to grad students. Are there opportunities for me to get applied experiences? And the caveat that I like to throw out there is that even if you want to go academic, you should plan to do some of these consulting opportunities because it makes you a better professor. And on the flip side, if you want to go academic or go applied, you should plan to do some teaching because, again, if you can explain a correlation to a 18-year-old, you can explain a correlation to an executive. So having and looking at and playing these experiences off each other, I think, is really important.
Great. Any follow-up on that question from anyone else? Okay. Well, let's move to question 3. How should I go about getting research experience? Does my research experience need to be IO specific, or is it okay to do research in other areas of psychology or other fields? What do we have on this one?
I'm happy to jump in here. I would say that it's okay if you don't have an IO psychology department at your school. It's okay if you can't get research experience in psychology. I would say that that is ideal. If you can get experience in IO, that's excellent. If not, I would definitely try to get experience in psychology. But if not, I know students who are in my program who had a pre-med background, who had research experience that way. So you kind of see what's possible and kind of work down the line depending on what your options are. In terms of going about getting research experience, what I did is I would reach out to faculty. I would ask them if they had openings in their lab or if they had any need for research assistance. And I also heavily reached out to graduate students because, again, faculty are very busy. Oftentimes, they may not have a need, but one of their graduate students does. So, in fact, the way I got all of my letters of recommendation when I applied to grad school was by initially working with graduate students of the faculty member who I ultimately started working for. And I noticed a caveat to that question which asked, well, what do I do if I'm not enrolled at a university or if I've taken a few years off? And I actually did this myself. So although I was enrolled part-time as a non-degree seeking student, I took some time off. And it's not a problem if you're not at the university. You can still reach out to local universities or even maybe ones that aren't exactly in your area and ask if there are any projects that you might be able to help with remotely. Or if you can drive to that university, perhaps they would be open to you still assisting, even if you aren't a student. I know that I've had people inquire, people who are working who want research experience. People have emailed me, and I'm totally open to that as well. So you don't have to be an undergraduate student to get research experience.
Yeah, to add on to that, because I think it's a hard problem, and I will occasionally get emails. I've been out of school for 3 or 4 years. I want to apply to graduate school, but I've never done research. How do I start? And you're motivated to try to help that person. And I think 2 things you can do in making the ask is, 1, be really clear about your motivation for graduate school. So simply by that person saying, I know to get into a good graduate program, I need to have research experience, tells me something about their academic maturity. So that's helpful. And the second one is, if there's anything that you have specifically to offer as you're reaching out. So for example, you might be working in industry, and you might say, I know that you might be really interested in getting a field sample for some of your research. I think I might be able to help you collect data where I'm at if I'm part of your team. Or I have really great data management skills. If there's a way that I can help on one of your projects. So just thinking about what are the assets that you bring to the graduate student or the faculty member that you're approaching that makes a more persuasive case for them to try to help you out in terms of what your goals are.
Great. Other responses to this question? All right. We can move to question 4. How are doctoral degrees in organizational behavior seen differently than IO psychology degrees by business professionals? A lot of pieces to that. Did you consider OB before choosing IO? And I will tell you my answer is no. What do others think?
I guess I can go ahead and jump in here. So if your goal is to get a academic job in an OB program, you're probably better to go to an OB program to start with, mainly because of accreditation issues. Management programs, OB programs, they can only hire so many people outside of the OB field in order to keep their accreditation with their accrediting body, which I learned the hard way when I was switching universities. It was something that I learned kind of on the back end. So yes, I have looked at OB, becoming an OB, going into OB faculty positions, but it's not something that I ended up pursuing, in part because for me, one of the big differences and one of the things I love about IO is that we take a bottom-up and top-down kind of perspective. We take the employee's perspective, but we also integrate the management's perspective and macro-level issues. Whereas in OB programs, and this is my personal view, and I talk to OB people and they disagree with me all the time, that OB tends to take more of that bottom-down perspective. They tend to look at more macro-level issues. What we refer to as macro-level issues, they sometimes refer to as micro-level issues because the economies of scale are so different in OB programs, where they're looking at industry-wide issues versus organization-level issues. And so organizational level issues become micro-level issues to them. So I think that's one of the big differences. And again, it's that academic maturity of knowing where you want to be and thinking about yourself. Where do I want to be in 20 or 30 years? And trying to, that's a very scary thought, even for me at this point in my career. Where do I want to be in 20 years? Trying to figure those things out to the best of your ability is kind of important and will help address this sort of, if you want to go that OB route eventually, well, why not start now versus going into an IO program?
I think to add to that, Russell, too, also, I remember there was, I think, a survey through SIOP that came out last year, the year before, talking about the different differences in training for IO site programs versus OB programs. And one of the big differences has always been already been pointed out is most OB programs are really training people for academic careers. And because of that, I think they said that of the surveyed OB programs, none of them offered formal internship opportunities or applied experiences in that regard. And so if you're thinking you would like to go applied, an IO psychology degree kind of keeps that side open for you by giving you those experiences, because a lot of programs will have some type of internship experience, whether required or optional.
I would echo that same thing. You know, I definitely considered OB before IO. IO is one of the most versatile degrees, and on the other end, OB is very, very focused on academic. Every program I looked at, 100% of the graduates were going academic. It doesn't mean there's no way to move out, but that says a lot. And if you're thinking applied at all, that may close you off from that end of things.
You can see the philosophy reflected a little bit in the way the conferences turn out. So you probably haven't been to a conference yet, but we have yearly conferences in pretty much every field in all of academia. The SIOP conference being held in April or May periodically, and the AOM conference being held around August, September. But when you go to those, you find that SIOP is a really good blend of academics and practitioners. Everybody comes together to study these issues that we think are so important. If you go to Academy, you will notice Academy of Management, then you notice that it's pretty much academics. The practitioner force, like there are a few there, but it is really not the emphasis. IO is much more about that blend, about really getting the important perspectives from both, and about once you move into practice to remain a scholar, to be a scholar in practice. We're even working right now with an organization in my research lab, a consultancy, and they're actually working on basic science research in their consultancy, and they're pursuing research grants. So that's a very much an IO kind of perspective that leads to that you're not going to really find in an OB program so much.
And the last thing I was just going to add to that is that I can't really speak to whether or not OB faculty do this, but even IO academics, oftentimes, you've heard our panel members speak about this, have consulting opportunities. I find that in IO, I think our faculty are even their scholarship is very intertwined with the practice. So many of the faculty members at my program use their consulting opportunities to look at interesting research questions and vice versa.
All right. Well, let's move to question 5. How should I go about finding current graduate students to talk to? What is the best approach there?
Well, since I'm a current graduate student, I'll jump in again. We're often on the websites, usually. I find that we're typically on the department website. Another great resource is LinkedIn. There are many, many graduate students on LinkedIn. So if you make yourself a nice profile and list yourself as a current student or whatever you're doing, you can often find graduate students through one of those 2 ways.
Great. Well, question 6. I read that IO psychology is not accredited. Oh boy. Will this impact my job prospects? Accreditation is a tricky issue in IO psychology. What do folks have to think about this?
So I can take this one on. So a couple of things. So now we're talking about the practice of IO psychology. So you're applied now. You're working as a consultant. The practice of any field of psychology is controlled at the state level. It's not a federal issue, and different states have different laws that regulate the practice of it. But primarily, the practice of psychology is controlled when it's dealing with the treatment of individuals. So that would primarily mean, for example, psychotherapy, or even psychological assessment of someone. And the position of the American Psychological Association and the position of most states is that IO psychology is a practice that affects organizations, not individuals. And that tends to be an argument that states buy. So what does that mean? The bottom line is that accreditation really doesn't matter much to, if at all, to the practice of IO psychology. So there are very few programs that are accredited. Same thing holds for licensing, by the way. There are some states that license the practice of IO psychology, but most don't. And so really what you wind up doing is when you have your PhD or your master's, is that you're hired to do certain tasks, and what you do, I should be clear, in some states, even with a PhD, you may not be allowed to call yourself a PhD psychologist. You may not be allowed to call yourself a psychologist, but you get to do leadership development, you get to do organizational surveys, you get to do organizational development, all the things that you've learned to do. You can do all of those whether or not you came from an accredited program, whether or not you're eligible for license. So in the short answer is, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, if I scared anyone with my talk about this is a tricky issue, it's because SIOP has actually discussed this on a number of occasions as to whether it's a good idea to have licensure, that sort of thing. So some people are very passionate both ways, but right now, unless you want to do therapy in an organization, it's not super critical. Absolutely. Other thoughts on this question? All right, question 7. How does tuition usually work in master's and PhD programs? In master's programs, are students set up with part-time internships to help offset costs? That would be great. What do folks think?
So I'm going to introduce the audience to a very important term in IO psychology. It depends. So it depends on what program you're looking at. So I think one of the common misconceptions is that only PhD programs have tuition waivers and scholarships, and that's not true. There are master's programs that have tuition waivers and scholarships. Sometimes they're more limited, sometimes they're fully funded, and you will have PhD programs where it's the same sort of deal, where you're actually paying to get your PhD. So there's a lot of variety, and that's just something that you have to educate yourself on. I think that's actually one of the most important issues to educate yourself on, is the financial side of things. A lot of programs, they'll offer a tuition waiver and then a scholarship or a stipend or something like that. So educating yourself around what those are. Being at an institution that has a lower stipend level than other programs, but a lower cost of living, taking into account the cost of living adjustment is another issue, where that stipend at some school might sound great, but when you factor in cost of living, it's a whole different bailiwick. So it really does depend upon the program you're looking at and what financial options are available. There's a few master's programs that I know that have set aside scholarships for their students. So just taking the time to educate yourself is really important.
And let me re-echo that cost of living issue. Our university is located in a coastal area on the East Coast, and we compete with, let's say, some large big city schools that are not too far away from us. And even though we offer slightly less money, the cost of living is much better here. So really think about that when you think about what your standard of living will actually be. I would even go so far as to say don't be afraid of at least federal student loans. The amount of money that you'll be making in the future after you have an IO degree is just so dramatically different than the amount of money you probably have now or as a college student that you may not find at least some level of loans to be so bad in the future. So that's a very important kind of financial question to really dig into and answer for yourself. Other responses to this?
And I think one of the question was internship opportunities. I'm familiar with a few programs that do have internships or beyond just, so some programs will have TA opportunities, other programs will have part-time internships. And again, that's very idiosyncratic to programs, and even within programs, it'll be differentiated. Some faculty will say, you know what, I don't like my students doing internships their first 2 years, and here's why. And going back to what Richard was saying, being aware of what your loan options are and work-study options are. There's a lot of variability, but yeah, there are programs where internships are, and they will help you set up those internships. Other programs will say, yeah, that's great, go on internship. Good luck, you have to figure it out yourself. So those are, again, questions to ask when you're trying to do your due diligence to find out, is this a program that I want to attend to? But that financial issue is huge, and realizing it, like with a master's program, you're going to come out and you're going to make less, as Kurt was saying, than you would as a PhD. And if you're having to self-fund $30,000 plus cost of other things, so tuition and life costs, that adds up very quickly, and that you need to be aware of.
Great. Any final thoughts on this? All right. So we move to question 8. What is the best path to become a consultant? Ooh. Would a master's prepare someone, or would a PhD be better? I think we're going to hear some "it depends" to this question. What do folks think?
Well, I'll go first. It depends. I want to echo what I said earlier, in that it's really important to understand that a master's degree can be a good path to having a fulfilling, interesting job doing biopsychology work. And it may be that either in terms of what your interests are, your financial resources, your age, there's a lot of reasons why a PhD program may not be the best option. And so it's terrific that you have this master's option and you can be in school for a couple of years and get a great job. The two caveats to that are, one that I said earlier, typically the range of tasks that you're going to do, your ability to supervise others, probably a ceiling on your career. All of those are a lot more limited if you have a master's degree versus a PhD. And secondly, there's a good chance, let's say there's a job that it's a terrific consulting job, you have and it's pays $70,000 a year, you're qualified for it, you have your master's degree, and there's someone with a PhD degree who's willing to take the same job for $70,000. A lot of companies are going to hire the PhD. Not all, but a lot of them will. So you need to kind of take that into account as well. I think my general advice is, if you have the time, if you have the inclination, you have the grit, because 5 years to a PhD is a lot of work, a lot of effort. But if you can do that and you're qualified and you're a strong competitive candidate, I think your options are always better. The one advice I always give people is do things that give you more options later rather than fewer. And I think you have more options to go consulting with a PhD. But again, recognizing maybe you don't have the GPA, you don't have the time, you don't have the money, or whatever it is, the flexibility, recognizing that the master's is a good alternative.
Great. Any other thoughts on becoming a consultant?
Well, I will say that very early on in the process, I had been speaking to a lot of different people with different degrees, and there's a lot of work being done by people with masters that is fascinating, and you can really do a lot there. At the same time, first of all, the way it was once explained to me is they might be more implementing things, and people with a PhD might be a little more a little better prepared to figure out solutions and really diagnose. But there's really a lot of work being done on both ends, definitely.
All right. So let's move to question 9. I'm interested in health research. Are there health components of IO psychology? And I think if you've looked into this a whole lot, you might have seen the term occupational health psychology, which is pretty closely related to IO. Who would like to tackle this?
Go ahead, Kurt.
Yeah, Richard used the term occupational health, and if you're interested in kind of health outcomes, so well-being, freedom from stress, issues like that, I would spend a lot of time researching occupational health as a career path. And what you'll find is that there are some occupational health programs that are separate, but many of them are located within an IO psychology program or kind of co-located with one. And so, for example, Bowling Green, where Russell is, Colorado State, where I am, Portland State, there's one or two others that I'm blanking on. There's a lot of programs that have very strong competitive doctoral programs in IO where you can either pick up a couple of classes to kind of round out your education as an elective, or you could go there and say, well, I like IO, what I'm really interested in are the occupational health outcomes and specialize. The thing to keep in mind here is that there are other really good doctoral programs who don't offer that specialization. So understanding what the options are and then identifying those targets that can give you both the IO perspective and the occupational health viewpoints, and really including those on your short list of programs.
What I'll add to that is Society for Occupational Health Psychology. So if you type in SOHP or occupational health psychology, as Kurt mentioned, oftentimes these OHP programs are nested within IO programs, and there are a few that aren't, but you can get a lot of information there as well.
And I apologize, Maryana, I left out USF.
I was going to throw that in for you.
Yeah, I was just going to say USF, my program, couches OHP within the IO program, just like you were talking about. So yes, it's been a great opportunity, and you do get the full, a lot of programs will give you the full IO experience with an additional specialization in OHP. So it's more like a minor in my program. So it's a specialization or a concentration, we call it.
Yeah, you know, this it really echoes kind of an earlier principle that if you're really die-hard set on a particular area of biopsychology, really important to do your due diligence to figure out where has that opportunity for you to pursue. Well, all right, we're actually at time, so I'm gonna call it. Thank you all so much for coming to our webinar on questions about grad school and IO psychology. This whole event, including Q&A, I believe, will be posted on the SIOP official YouTube channel. Probably be up in about a week, so if you want to check back then, you'll be able to get all that information for whenever you need it. And that's it. Thank you all so much. Thank you to our panelists, and good luck with grad school.
Thank you.